Hey guys, Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the suspension, both front and rear on the F15 X5 and F16 X6. This will also cover the F85 X5M and the F86 X6M, as well as the previous generation E70 X5 and E71 X6. Some of the parts are different just in terms of part numbers, but the overall architecture of the platform is the same. So really anything that we talk about in this video pertaining to the F15 will also cover those vehicles as well. Now this particular example on the lift behind me, it's a standard version of the X5, so it doesn't have the VDC suspension or the electronic dampers or air suspension in the rear. So this is gonna be really more of a standard typical X5, probably a majority of the vehicles out on the road. But I did want to mention that before we get into it, we're not gonna cover the VDC aspect of it. We're primarily just looking at the major components, things that wear out, things to be aware of when you own these vehicles. And most of what we talk about today is gonna cover all of that regardless of the suspension type that's installed. So that said, let's go ahead and go to the front suspension and start talking about the design up front and things to be aware of. All right, so we're gonna start here in the front suspension. We can call this a double wishbone suspension, although technically it's not quite a double wishbone because BMW still retained the thrust arm and the lower wishbone. It does add certain complexity to the suspension, and there's obviously more stuff. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff in here that could start to make noise and wear over time. On the control arm side, we have our lower wishbone here. Basically, this control arm connects the knuckle to the subframe, and it's also the attachment point for our strut here. So we have this fork, there's a bushing here that this bolts through, and a really common source of noise in the front suspension on this is if this bushing is starting to wear in here, you'll get a decent amount of side-to-side play between where the bolt goes through. So you'll actually see a lot of movement between the fork and the control arm itself. Now there is supposed to be movement there, but if you are looking at the bushing and you see any kind of tearing or disintegration of the rubber, that's how you know you have a problem specifically with this bushing here. Another thing that you can also look for too, if you see a lot of like reddish, brownish dust in this area, that's another sign that that bushing is on its way out too. So kind of be aware of that. To that end, you also have your outer ball joint and your inner bushing. Those are both wear items. This control arm generally is not as much of a wear item as the thrust arm would be, which is this bigger control arm here. This basically handles all of the road force as you're driving down the road. So this maintains general suspension geometry in the front. Typically what you're gonna see here is this inboard bushing, which is hydraulic filled. This is going to be the thing that wears out probably first on any of these suspensions. You'll see kind of a greasy, oily residue around this area if this bushing has failed. Another thing that's gonna happen too is you might notice some vibrations while you're driving down the highway. It might seem like you have a wheel out of balance, but these thrust arms are known to cause that kind of condition. Ball joint, these are always a wear item. If there's any kind of play in this area, you would normally be able to feel it by giving the wheel a shake at the 9 and 3 o'clock position, and also from the 12 and 6. If you feel any kind of slop in the suspension, you really want to look at these lower connections here, because that's really where it's going to happen more than anything else. Obviously you have your tie rod here. It's not necessarily suspension related, but it kind of is, because if there's something wrong with this component, ball joint is worn out, the inner is worn out, or even if this locking bolt is loose, well, steering is not going to feel too good, and it's also really dangerous. So you want to check for play in the ball joint, and you want to check for play at the inner joint. Again, a shake from the 9 o'clock or 3 o'clock position. If there's any slop in this, you will feel it. Moving on, of course, you have our sway bar here. Sway bar links are notorious on BMWs for making noise. Sometimes you can't even really detect play, but if you're driving down the road and you hit a bump and you hear a click, like a tinny, cheap sounding click, more times than not, it is the sway bar link that's making that noise. The sway bar, at least on these cars, conveniently goes up over the top of the subframe. So that's fun. But one thing to note is the sway bar bushings are bonded to the sway bar. So it's vulcanized rubber. There's no replacement bushing that you can buy for the stock sway bar. I think I've seen some repair kits out there where you can do like polyurethane bushings instead. Those have their own issues, but again, you would have to remove the sway bar, get rid of all the rubber. One thing to note is like clunking sounds. If you go over a bump and you hear a clunk, totally possible the sway bar could be making that noise, and if the bushing has failed on the sway bar, you are replacing the sway bar. So now looking up at the upper part of the suspension here, you can obviously see where the strut bolts up to the strut tower, but you also see this upper wishbone, which is a pretty, it's a smaller control arm relative to the lower, but the number one issue that this platform has is there's no camber adjustment. So if you have a car and you've taken it in for an alignment and the camber is out of spec, the only way to fix it originally was to buy a special control arm from BMW at an exorbitant price. If you look at the factory style control arm, just standard rubber bushings inboard, but again, there is no adjustment up there. Another option for fixing this issue is this Miley HD control arm. It has a slotted ball joint, so this ball joint could physically slide in or out to add or remove camber. It has a pinned hole in the middle for just standard settings. But if anybody needed to do a camber correction on one of these cars, this is a good alternative, and also the ball joint is serviceable, so we offer that. This is probably one of the better solutions on the market for dealing with the camber problem. And lastly, here in our front suspension, we have our strut. It's not a McPherson strut style suspension, so the strut is not part of the steering mechanism on the car. So this remains stationary, so the top strut mount, there isn't like an integrated strut bearing that can go bad or anything like that. Really, it's just a aluminum housing with a rubber bushing in the middle. You have your coil spring shim, your coil spring, your bump stop, your dust bellow, and then the actual strut itself. Struts can make noise before they ever wear out, so sometimes if you're going over a bump, you might hear or even feel a little bit through the steering wheel, just kind of like a little bit of an off noise. Look at the struts. If you see any kind of external leaks, so if you're looking at the housing of the damper and you see any kind of oil film on the outside, that means the strut is starting to leak, and for sure, you're gonna have to replace it. Generally speaking, your typical factory struts are probably going to be good upwards of 50,000 miles, maybe 60,000 miles if you drive really good condition roads. But over time, these do wear out internally. They lose their ability to dampen out the spring oscillations. So ride quality is kind of this slowly degrading thing over a period of time. So we're gonna be doing DIYs on pretty much everything in the front suspension. Control arm replacements, strut replacement. We're gonna pretty much take care of the entire front suspension. So we'll have the videos on how to take care of that. But with that said, let's move to the rear suspension. There's a whole bunch of other interesting things happening back there. And we'll talk about that rear design and things to be aware of in there. All right, so now we're here at the rear suspension. Want to reiterate that this is a standard suspension vehicle, so it doesn't have air springs in the rear, just standard coil springs. Normally you'd have air springs on like a VDC car or a car with third row seating. What we have here in the rear suspension, we can call this BMW's Integral Link rear suspension, or Z-Link. It's called an Integral Link suspension because it has this Integral Link right here for the lower swing arm. So you have this big lower control arm, which is pretty much the base for the whole rear suspension. These typically, and this is aluminum casting, these don't go bad, but the inboard bushings can go bad. And what we have on this car specifically, and this is pretty much any of these Z-Link or Integral Link rear suspensions from BMW, you have your camber and toe adjustments in the rear, so eccentrics via the upper and lower arms here. And really there's a handful of problems. These eccentric bolts can become seized, which makes alignments impossible. Or the inboard bushings become really loose and your alignment's all over the place all over the time. The lower swing arm technically does not have serviceable bushings per BMW, but there are replacement bushings out on the market for it, basically factory replacement bushings. So they can be serviced, fortunately, because this lower arm itself is quite expensive on its own. So that's nice that there is a repair solution for it. Your upper arms here, you have both your toe link and then you have your forward link here. This is a guide link. Again, ball joints, bushings, typical wear items, any kind of slop in there is going to cause issues one way or the other. Outside of the control arms, we also have a pressed-in ball joint at the knuckle that connects to the integral link. These ball joints will wear out over time and you'll start to feel some really weird shifting in the rear suspension. More times than not, it is this ball joint having completely worn out and has a lot of play. The way to tell that ball joint is totally wasted is if you grab the wheel from 12 and 6 o'clock and you pull from 6 o'clock, you're gonna get a lot of wheel movement because this more or less locates the entire axle in the rear. But to that end, you have this integral link here, which has a really long bolt that runs through it. There's a bushing in the integral link here, and there's an upper bushing here as well. So when this ball joint is being replaced, it's also a very good idea to replace the integral link at the same time, because what that does is it ties it into the knuckle, and this basically acts as a whole pivot for the outer suspension. Sway bar links, another source of noise on these cars, very much similar to the front, but typically you won't hear the rear sway bar links really make any noise. It's typically the fronts. Sway bar bushing is another source of noise, pretty much the same as the front. And then you have your shock absorber in the rear. Very simple design. You have your upper shock mount that bolts to the bottom of the chassis with 3 bolts. It has a rubber bushing in it. A worn shock mount will make a ton of noise because anytime the suspension is under compression, basically it's forcing everything up inside the car. If you hear like loud clunks over the rear, or the rear end feels a little bit sloppy, this could be one of the issues. And again, like with any damper, I would say the factory shocks and struts, again, rear suspension, no different. 50 to 65,000 miles. If you were gonna replace just the shocks in the rear, replace both sides. If one is leaking, the other side is not too far away from having a problem. So always replace them in pairs. And to that end, also replace any suspension components in pairs anyway. Yeah, another thing to be aware of is if you have some kind of ride height issue in the rear suspension, this would apply if you have air springs or just coil springs like this. Air springs, they could tear and they'll leak, and you'll never actually get up to ride height. But if a coil spring fails, they normally fail at the very ends where the material is the thinnest. If the coil spring cracks and you notice that one corner of the car is sitting substantially lower than the other, chances are the coil spring has broken and it's going to need to be replaced. Not too difficult of an operation on this car, fortunately, but one thing to note with BMW coil springs, they are looked up by VIN. So can't look them up by applications, can't even confirm them by the color marks on the spring because often they're not even there anymore. Pretty much any coil spring on a BMW F95 is confirmed by the VIN. So I think that pretty much covers everything that we need to talk about in the rear suspension. Obviously the front and the rear, very different from one another, but now to cover the rear, let's go back to the table, go ahead and close this video out. Obviously a lot of components in the suspension, a lot of possibilities for noise to be generated from just about any connection point. But hope you learned something in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. Hit that like button if you like this video, also subscribe. Like I said, we'll have all the content pertaining to the suspension coming out very soon. So be on the lookout for that. So we want to hit that subscribe button. But other than that, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.